Great. Well, again, welcome everybody to today's session where we're talking about from homes to infrastructure, building community resilience. Again, I am Erik Backus from Clarkson University. I'm a professor there, Lieutenant Colonel retired. We'll get more about my bio in a little bit. Really glad to have you for this, and we've got some great panelists to be part of a discussion today to talk about this topic. Vatsal, Bhatt, and Kimberly Vermeer. So Vermeer, excuse me, to talk about some things. But to get us signed up, I want to let you know this is part of a bigger movement. We're on our fourth year now. I can't believe this. We started planning the series on resilience between Society of American Military Engineers, New York City Post, and the Middle Atlantic Northeast region of USGBC 4 years ago. And we now are on our third run of a series of lunch and learns that lead then at the end of during COVID, we couldn't do it together, but now we actually get together for a summit, a one-day summit on resilience. And it's been a really dynamic set of topics. Everything from, we started this in the middle of a pandemic, talking about how to deal with COVID, thinking about resilient schools, thinking about coastal places being impacted in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. If you don't remember, it was 10 years ago in October of this past year. We had, in 2012 is when Hurricane Sandy hit. It was a pretty momentous thing for the New York metro area and beyond, frankly, devastating, significant parts of the Northeast. And we've really been working hard trying to bring relevant topics about where things are going and how do we build resilience in a whole bunch of different ways. And it's really great to have, government partners and others. And so just want to introduce our steering committee team. Some of us are pictured here. Sarah Swilka from Stantec. Thank you, Sarah, for your leadership. Medea Valeri, who's been our USGBC staff supporter throughout. We have other staffers now with us as well. Let's introduce a couple of them. Now full bird colonel, Benjamin Wall. We started as lieutenant colonel, so you can see this stuff actually gets you promoted if you do resilience. It's a good thing. Suzanne DiGeronimo, who owns her own firm. She's an architect in the city, and she's part of the CERT working group in the city. Joseph Robecchio, who is Carbon Key, owns his things. So he's also lieutenant colonel retired, similar to myself. And then some others, Joe Manis, who is part of the community of interest for resilience for the Society of American Military Engineers. Michael Serrano, who kind of does a lot of the marketing and things like that for his SAME New York City Post. And of course, Monique Owens and Rebecca Bentley, the other staff who are there. But you can see, as we were just talking beforehand, if you heard us talking about hockey, I'm a Washington Capitals fan, so I'm in a jersey here in this particular photo. But that's some of us taking, this is our start. We were in the middle of COVID and kind of making it happen. So again, I want to thank the continued support of the USGBC, especially the Mid-Atlantic and North New England region of USGBC for continuing to support, providing the platform for this. It's been great to have them, do that, and thank Monique and Rebecca, who come on in the last year and really, been helping us right along. So it's really great to have part of that. So just a reminder, as I kind of advertise on the front end, this is eligible for AIA credit. So if you're looking to get that, or you're an architect, it's also going to be eligible for things like GBCI credit for continuing education, as well as PDHs for us engineer types. All of this is just to kind of give you that warm up to let you know what's going on and where's we're going. So what are we doing today? So the session is really going to be talking between the three of us, myself, Vatsal, and Kimberly, about what's going on in community resilience, thinking about that in several different angles and bringing to you what's going on in those areas. These are the learning objectives. I normally pass over this slide pretty quick, but just remember these learning objectives and be listening today as we go through our panel discussion, because there might be some questions at the end, check on learning, that you'll have that reflect these statements that may be formed as a question. So if you're wondering what those are, you may, and if you are doing a PDH, you'll get these questions later. The ones that have the end, they have to take a little short survey, so you can contribute a little bit of notes as we go along. You can get that for yourself. So introduce myself a little further. Again, I'll be today's moderator, kicking us off, getting us started, and starting the dialogue. I'm a professor of practice at Clarkson, so my world is not. I certainly do research, but I also do a lot of consulting and work in community, especially in and around the North Country, New York. So if you're wondering where Clarkson is, and we were just discussing this amongst the panelists, if you can imagine where Ottawa, Canada is, we are a little south of that, and we are north of the Adirondack Park in New York State. So that's where Potsdam, New York is where I live. We also have campuses in Schenectady, New York, in the capital region of New York State. as well as campus in Beacon, New York, which is down in the lower Hudson Valley. And then we also offer courses down in the city, of course. So we're throughout New York State in a private institution. I've been also a past chair of the upstate New York board of the USGBC, still a member of that. And of course, very active in SAME as my former life as a Corps of Engineer officer will speak. So one of the things that I've been working on, I just want to highlight as part of the conversation today, is this idea of sustainable holistic planning systems. Myself and 5 other colleagues have been working for a better part of 4 years now, trying to better understand how we move beyond kind of what has been sustainability rating systems to something that thinks much more broadly, much more at scale. Vatsal and I were having this banter beforehand, thinking about this with Kimberly, about where scale goes, but how to actually start classifying and defining what this next generation of planning is going to look like as we look at planning for communities across various different scales and locations. And how do we start putting some ways to understand what they really are? And so you're seeing on a slide here in the bottom left is what we think is a taxonomy of what a sustainable planning system, sustainable holistic planning system is, or a SHIPS is. And it involves several different dimensions: sustainability, holism, and of course planning. But then within each of those are certain indicators or certain things, the questions we should be asking about what is happening within those systems that do that. And so we've been looking at a variety of these different systems. There's 3 on the right that we've been done a deeper dive in. One is, of course, LEED for cities and communities. I'm gonna let Vatsal talk more about that. Another one is New York State Climate Smart Communities, which is really nice because it's applicable to what we're doing here with this group, especially the Middle Atlantic and North New England region, about one of the major key states, and there's parallels in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And then the Smart Growth Self-Assessment for Rural Communities was actually an EPA system that they developed, and looking at these and saying, hey, where do they fit? And we think using some of these exemplars or harder cases, we've really kind of cued into what are these things. And so as we go through this conversation today, I'm going to come back to this because this all talks about resilience and where things are. Are we building communities that are resilient? And so going forward with that. So with this, I'm going to hand it over the intros to the next person in line. Vatsal, will you please talk a little bit about yourself?
Surely. Thanks a lot, Eric, for bringing us.
I'm not hearing you, Vatsal.
Oh, I hear you. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, Eric, for this introduction and bringing us all together. I wanted to thank my colleague in the Middle Atlantic and New England region for setting this up along with SAME. And thanks, Kim, for joining us today. I think I represent Lead for Cities and Communities program at US Green Building Council. I especially focus on Lead for Communities part of the Cities and Communities rating system, where I work as a vice president. And I have been working in this field of urban planning and energy economics for more than 23 years. And almost 8.5 years ago, I helped conceptualize Lead for Cities and Communities rating system, launched it in December 2016. And now I'm working with more than 150 communities towards Lead for Community projects. They are registered, and right now they are working towards certification, pre-certification kind of aspects. Previously, before starting to work with US Green Building Council, I worked at Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island, where I helped US Department of Energy and Department of State in a lot of bilateral, multilateral collaborations with India, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and many other international discussions. I also worked on energy economics, hardcore for US Department of Energy, and my analysis has gone into President's State of the Union address a couple of times. I have also been a lead author of US Global Change Research Program's first ever assessment of impacts of climate change on energy production and use in the United States, and many such other reputable publications. Eric, next please. So talking about today's topic on resilience and connecting Lead for Cities and Communities in this particular topic. The graphic on the right hand side is extensive. You don't need to go into details. We will talk more about it, but These are all the credits and requirements on the left-hand side of this particular Excel spreadsheet kind of screenshot that you see. And on the right-hand side, on a column, it says how resilience is interconnected. Thanks a lot, Eric. And how resilience is interconnected in each of those credits and requirements of LEED for cities and communities rating system. And we'll talk more about it. But the graphic on the left-hand side, the graphic that you see in orangish, yellowish color, is telling you the gist of that discussion, that out of all these requirements, 75% or more than 75% of these requirements really talk about resilience-related aspects in plan and design rating system. And another rating system that we have is for existing cities and communities, where nearly 62% or more than 62% of the requirement focus on resilience. So with that kind of very primitive, very cursory, high-level background, I would let Kim talk about her priorities in today's discussion. But I will touch upon some of these things as we all chug along this particular process and keep on weaving all these different aspects in the discussions for the next hour. Thank you, Eric. Thanks, Kim.
Well, hello, everyone. So glad that you are all here and that we're able to be with you today for this conversation. And thanks to the USGBC main region for organizing, and Eric for organizing all of us on the panel today. It's just going to be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I have to do a special shout out to all the women in green, me literally, as it's International Women's Day today. So let's hear it for women in green, especially today. So I am Kim Vermeer, president of Urban Habitat Initiatives, and I'm a consultant, an author, and a podcaster. And although I've been primarily focused on sustainability, resilience is a growing element of what has to be addressed as we think about sustainability. So as a consultant, both as my personal motivators and with the company, we're really bringing resilience into the conversation as integral to how we think about sustainability and green buildings. And we're doing this on a project by project basis, just helping the owners, the developers, and the teams really think through what resilience means for a project. And I'll give some examples from some projects as we move through the conversation today. But increasingly, we're working with organizations who are realizing that this can't be a building by building, project by project thing. They really have to be thinking about resilience more comprehensively at an organizational level, a portfolio level, of people that they're serving level. Now, as an author, in the book I wrote with Walker Wells a couple of years ago, we focused on how to build great green affordable housing. But we also said, again, this, you don't build in a vacuum. The world is changing. What are the trends? And so what we had identified are, in fact, some of the things we're talking about today, that the conversation about what it means to be green is shifting rapidly to say, what does that mean for climate? What does that mean about decarbonization? And really explicitly beginning to address those concepts when we talk about sustainability. And then another element that we saw coming fast was the need to talk about the context of a building and to really think about what it means to be green beyond the building. And so we still have to build great green buildings. In fact, I was just recently looking at the guidebook for the Better Climate program that EPA has initiated. And they make the point that it's still the most important energy in a building is the energy it's never going to need at all. And so we still need to start with that focus on energy efficiency, on healthy buildings, on great green buildings as we expand the conversation into climate decarbonization and resilience. Then in the podcast, we really have focused on sharing the stories and celebrating the successes of the people who are building great projects. But we're always looking for new ideas. And so if you have suggestions for projects that you know are really doing a great job at incorporating resilience into their green strategies. Put your name and contact information in the chat. Say, I have a great podcast idea, and I'll follow up with you later. And it's a great time to catch up. We produced season 1 a year or so ago, and we've got some new episodes that we're going to be releasing this spring. So it's a good time to subscribe and catch up. And I think midday I can put the links for catching stuff there. And if you want to buy the book, you can go to Island Press and they'll give you a 30% discount if you use the code webinar. So enough advertising. So I was excited to be part of this conversation about resilience today because, you know, as I travel through the world of commercial real estate, I've heard some troubling framing, which is that things are being sorted into bins, right? We have the sustainability bin, we have the climate bin, and we have the resilience bin. And there are owners and developers and certification systems that are saying, well, these are 3 different things that we need to think about in the project. And they're defining sustainability as, you know, the green building part and the certification part. And then the climate is the decarbonization part. And then the resilience is thinking about adaptation and disaster response. But to me, this disaggregation and the disintegration and the sorting this into different things is the opposite of what we need. And, you know, one of the things that I have valued most about the sustainability movement is the push toward integrating disciplines and integrating the problems and looking for the synergies and the complexities that can be addressed together and get us to a better place. And to me, that's the approach we have to take to decarbonization and to resilience. We have to be bringing them all together, not picking them apart. And so as I think about resilience, a definition that I learned from the Kellogg Foundation when one of my clients was participating in their Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunities program was to think of resilience as being mitigation, adaptation, and social cohesion. And in that kind of a frame, then green building and decarbonization are part of the mitigation piece of resilience. And as we've said, we still have to keep doing that, right? That's essential. And adaptation is recognizing that there's embedded climate change and problems that are coming that we're just going to have to be ready for, and unknowns that we have to be able to react to as they come. And then social cohesion keeps us centered on actions for people and for community. And it reinforces the truth that we're in this together or we're sunk. And the other thing I like about this definition is that it helps us to think about different kinds of scales. So we can start with people and buildings, but then expand to neighborhoods and communities and to regions. And so for me, as someone who's working primarily in affordable housing and community development, and usually with nonprofit and community development organizations, to me, I'm mostly focused on the people, the residents of the building, and then the housing that these organizations are building in these organizations. And so kind of bringing that perspective to our conversation today, but really glad to be here with Vatsal and Erik so that we're talking about these wider scales of neighborhood and community and regional approaches to thinking about resilience.
Well, thanks, Kim. Appreciate that. And it's a great lead in, because I think the first question we want to tackle in this conversation is kind of leading off from that. And that is, how do we define resilience? I think that's one of the things that's a core. If we want to define community resilience, we need to understand what resilience is. And so I'm going to ask that question myself and then ask Vatsal to kind of give his perspective. I think you gave us a great opening perspective. There's kind of 2 schools of thought that I immediately come to when I think about the term resilience. One is the idea of resilience, kind of, and often in resilience engineering sphere, has been about the idea of bounce back, the ability to return back or to come back from an acute trauma or acute event that occurs that degrades capacity or degrades operational operations. And so we think about that at a community scale. That really has, in my mind, two axes, or if you will, or two things we need to think about. There are physical things that exist, if you will. There's nouns that we could call resilient, right? Having core infrastructure, the stuff that as an engineer I'm very comfortable with, that is stuff that, you know, having a backup generator placed in the right place so that instead of it getting flooded out, it's at an elevation and location, so there's power, a backup power. That's a thing, that's a noun. And so there are lots of that. There's lots of things we can do physically with the space to ensure that we can call something quote unquote resilient. And that's a lot of our community is made up of that. That's how we kind of underpin or give the foundation for what is resilient, right? That kind of gives us that. But it's not enough. There's another axis, another part of this that my colleague Tom Seeger at Arizona State is very positive in talking about, and that's the verbs. Resilience is a verb. It is things we're doing. It's adapting. It is mitigating. It is an action-based thing, and we should be going through a cycle constantly of evaluating what has changed in our world. What does that mean to us about what we should be doing to react to that change in our world? What are then we going to do to change in response to that change in our world? And then how do we then have a way to implement that so that we end up going back to, okay, now let's observe and see what's going on. It's kind of the cycle that will occur. And Tom does a much better job than I discussing that. It's really some of his key work. But when we think about resilience, we've got things. And so that good old wonderful curve, we all seen it, the critical functionality curve, the big dip, and then a recovery curve that comes back up. And I've started to kind of look at the different ways you can analyze that. That's kind of the noun stuff. And what is embedded in it is this idea that there's constantly a circle of a cycle of activity that has to have the verbs. And that is interpersonal. That is, how do we work together? How do we think about the challenges we all have of both place and people and the environment and the ecology around us and what is changing us? So to me, resilience is both a noun, it's things we do to kind of create the resilience, to the robustness and resilience to resist against whether acute or chronic traumas that we have or issues and something. But it more often is also those verbs. It's things we're having to do to make things go. So Vatsal, how would you answer this question of, well, how are we defining resilience?
Thank you so much. So you both provided very interesting perspectives. I'll go a little bit more technical. So generally speaking, in those technical terms, when we start talking about strengthening the resilience of a community, whether it is talking about climate change risk, natural or man-made hazards, or some of the other extreme events. And I think, of course, then there are other, parts of the resilience that is more to do with individuals and the way individuals resiliently react to some of these aspects of it, as Erik, you were trying to talk about mitigating, adapting, XYZ. But again, going back to that technical discussion about resilience, I think that is where in the cities and communities realm, we talk about really first defining the resilience in terms of whether what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve resilience against a specific risk or a hazard or a specific extreme event? And then we try to figure out how do we really go one step at a time and then really assess all the factors, try to understand the vulnerability, try to understand how this particular risk or hazard or extreme event is going to impact a city or a community. Then we do some kind of vulnerability and capacity assessment. What do we have on the ground? What do we need to do with it? And how do we really assess the vulnerability and assess the kind of ability to absorb shocks and how much? And then the kind of entire process of risk identification, risk assessment, vulnerability and capacity assessment, and possibility of adaptation. And then we go towards mitigation for the long-term discussion and figure out what are our goals and how do we try to adapt? Where do we need to provide training? Do we need to improve the infrastructure? Do we need to strengthen our ways in which we do it? So services and so on and so forth. So just providing a third angle of it, which is a little bit talking more technically about. But yeah, that's a kind of.
And that's all good. And I think you're right. I mean, there's all those things come into play. At some point, you know, if you're doing it, you want to measure how you're doing it, right? And you want to have ways to know you've done it, not just merely you say you do it, but you have ways to verify it. So that brings me to the next question we have, which is, you know, how do sustainability rating systems, such as LEED for communities, which I think you know smidge about just a little bit, capture resilience connected to holistic planning? Can you maybe speak to kind of how does LFC help holistic planning in communities? I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, so let me step back for a second before I really dirty my hands in all those details. So, like as you rightly said, Eric, when we are trying to design or even conceptualize some of these systems, we always figure out how do we really incorporate, say, resilience. And later we are talking about equity and other aspects of it as well, but say resilience. Then there are two ways of looking into us incorporating resilience in this kind of rating system. So as you were talking a few minutes ago about holistic planning. So do we consider resilience holistically, cutting it across each and every aspect of how we assess urban systems, XYZ, and deploy it and so on and so forth? Or we try to define it, designate it separately? It's a balance. It's a balance whether we really want to give emphasis to one aspect, two aspects, all the aspects, but then how do you really interconnect those aspects? It becomes an art more than technically doing it. So what we tried to do when we were designing this rating system in 2016, and then we tried to improve it in 2019, is to give it some significance by giving a specific credit for resilience planning, a specific credit for reliability and all those kind of things for, say, power systems, but then infuse aspects of resilience throughout the rating system. So as that particular one slide I was trying to show you all a few minutes ago during my introduction was to really start infusing this idea of holistic planning that Eric was trying to highlight a few minutes ago, and say, how can we really embed resiliency all across the board? In water, in energy, in waste, in transportation, public health, safety discussion, emergency planning discussion, and so on and so forth. With that, Eric, let me pause here. I know we're going to go much more in detail, but these are the conceptual level discussion I'm having. I can go much more in detail as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. One of the things that looking across a couple of these rating systems, so if we start looking at even LEED for neighborhood development, we start looking at green globes as a specific model, or star communities, green star communities out of Australia is a specific another example. You start looking at that what they're trying to get you to do is think about resilience as a key way you analyze all the different systems in the community, whether it be educational, whether it be health services, whether it be even as simple as agricultural. How do you incorporate resilience concepts into them? Is in these tools to a greater or lesser degree, some to a very low level, this kind of broad statements in the beginning that kind of hint at it. So ones that are very specific and capture it, on a T, say, hey, this is how you should be at least thinking about it, or at least engaging in this as part of the way to go through those rating systems. And so some are using game theory, kind of very similar to kind of the LEED approach to do it. Some are using it as a kind of a stick. You can't get this thing without this, and so a little bit different. So there's lots of other ways to get at it. So Kimberly, is there anything you want to kind of add to this about kind of where things like these rating systems come to play to get resilience into the planning process?
Well, certainly my experience with some LEED and D projects, that has, not that these are the words that are being used with the teams, but the focus on heat island mitigation, to the focus on better stormwater management, the focus on bringing in renewable energy and resilient infrastructure. I mean, those are all just by following the system, whether you realize it or not, you're developing a much more resilient community than you would absent the requirements to do those things. And I do a lot of work with the LEED for homes, the LEED for multifamily options. And there again, especially if we think about the let's stop causing the problem, the deep focus in LEED for reducing energy, whether it's from the building or for where you site it in terms of the transportation burden, saving water actually also saves energy. There's fundamentals into building a good green building that are contributing to that resilience. And then I think to the extent teams are starting to use the pilot credits to think specifically about what are the climate risks and threats, as Vatsal was saying earlier, where we're building this project and how might we respond in our building or tie into community resources and strategies that could help us be more resilient. I think these are all ways that we can use the tools we're familiar with and just be a little more aware of how resilience is actually built into them, and then be more explicit about discussing that with our teams and with our funders and our entitlement reviewers.
Right. So that actually brings me to my question. It's more of I'll start on answering it because I'm kind of the person working on this, is what differentiates sustainable holistic planning systems from other kinds of planning that we've done in the past? And I think part of it is, at first, we're either verbalizing or putting in writing those things. We're not making it a implied thing. We're making it explicit what has often been implicit. We're actually making it clear that we're going to start looking at, not only are we going to look at, hey, how much economic development we're going to get, so what's the dollars going to be in our community and make them better, but we're going to be explicit that we're going to look at all these different dimensions and all these different indicators within those dimensions to say, yep, we're actually making progress. It's actually going to make an impact, not just in three legs. It's not even a triple bottom line. The bottom line actually kind of implies some sort of magic accounting. But how about the people that are left behind? How are people left out of the conversation? We're going to make it explicit that we're going to be transparent in how we're doing it. We're going to think about policy as much as we're thinking about infrastructure. We're going to think about the broader perspectives and making it explicit what has often been seen behind the scenes, so that you now say, hey, we're not going to let this stuff just assume to happen. We're going to make it front and center. I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that, Vatsal. I think you're next on the list. If you have any other thoughts about how, the things you've been working with, how that has made a difference, and by making so what has been implicit explicit in that way.
Yeah, implicit and explicit are two ways in which we need to really start assessing the vulnerabilities, right? What are the risks? And then we also want to really start understanding the scenarios, meaning what are different ways in which we are going to have impacts of XYZ hazards or whatever risks that we are trying to evaluate. And then plan out more scenarios on top of it by saying what this community is, a city is, and then how it is getting impacted and what are its impacts going to be. And, it's not going to be linear. Many of these impacts are going to be with some probability. So we need to start understanding that probability as well, along with those scenario planning, and if what scenarios we need to start putting into it along with this holistic planning discussion. So I think with that perspective, yes, definitely we will have to look into the details of what are the risks, what are the impacts, and obviously, as you said, intrinsic and I think explicit part of these discussions, but at the same time, looking into various types of scenarios and then where it goes in the larger discussion. And and that particular community or a city that we are working with, for an example, how that particular community is going to react to it or is going to plan for it. So I think that is where assessment and then planning and holistic planning in that discussion with some scenario planning would be very, very useful. Whether that is about climate risks, whether that is about any other man-made or physical other risks, or some other soft kind of risks, and so on and so forth. So it'll have to be assessed in that particular discussion, and then try to look into it more from what kind of scenario planning as well.
That's great. And so maybe speaking of scenarios, one of the biggest scenarios and challenges often, and so I'm going to kick this as a question, really, it's going to go right to Kimberly, I think, really well. You know, how are affording housing developers, you have this great book, How to Green and Affordable Housing, right? You're the person that has it, responding to these resilience pressures. That's a specific scenario. We have a need for affordable housing, especially in places like Boston, New York City, our metro areas. We also have it in rural areas. How are housing developers getting to this resilience question? So the specific scenario.
Yeah, thanks. You know, the first thing is they are continuing to keep the priority on deeply green buildings, right? So just especially because they are thinking at the building scale mostly, right? And you know, the bringing together of the deep energy reductions and thinking about healthy buildings and where buildings are located, that remains, you know, essential to it. But then they have to think about what are the specifics of the risks, as Vatsal was saying, you know, what's the risk assessment and what's the response, right? So one of my clients was taking an abandoned industrial site on the edge of the Boston Harbor over in East Boston. And so it is, in fact, in a flood zone, but this site is going to be redeveloped, right, one way or another. And so they really focused on thinking about what does flooding mean for us, and what does that mean about where we set the floor levels, and what does it mean about the materials that we use, and can we imagine this building getting flooded and surviving. And so thinking about the lobby of the rental building doesn't have any paper type products in it or much wood either. It's materials that can get wet and can dry again. And if we did have a catastrophic flood, we would have tremendous water pressure from the wave action. And so we actually have the flood vents built into that level. And then other uses on that level are parking and other things that can flood and clear without destroying the building. And then there's a townhouse component, and those are built on a plinth that puts the first living level above the expected flood zone. So the combination of where we place the ground floor and thinking about the flooding of the materials. So of course the sea is the existential threat, but once we move inland and upland, the bigger issues are really stormwater management and heat. And so their clients are really thinking about, and the city is making us think about it, but we're taking on that challenge of how can we retain water on site? How can we reduce the flow to prevent flooding from our sites onto the surrounding communities? And also, how can we be part of the solution to reduce the urban heat island effects by the kind of roofing materials we use, trees, plantings, shading, structures, all those kind of things. So again, really thinking about some practical approaches once the risks have been identified, and recognizing that even within a city like Boston, the risks are not the same in East Boston that they are in Dorchester, that they are in Roxbury.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's really important to think about context, right? That there's no one size fits all for any of this. This is a very contextual thing that needs to be really thought about carefully. And that's both physical context, but also human context. what's the cultural aspects of that, what's going on in terms of interpersonal actions, and how the systems are all our various government systems and agencies, municipalities, and things like that. There's a set of things. So I'm going to actually turn. We deliberately put in a pause point. We were going to ask for more questions, but we already have 8 questions that have come in. Which, by the way, I want you to continue to ask us questions. This is phenomenal. We love it. There's been actually this kind of dialogue going on about, hey, I'm in New Jersey, and how do I deal with putting into place something like LEED for communities or cities, and how does that impact me? I think one of the things to think about is, what does your legal context look like, right? How do these things impact you? What's your legal context? Some states are home rule states where local municipalities can do a lot of work. Others are not home rule states where they are delegated authority states, and as a consequence, they have to do mother may I to the level. So it is, in some cases, there's a legal framework you have to kind of work around to address that. And so, and there's also the constant challenge of the urban legend versus reality, right? And what's the perceived versus what the real is. And I think that also is a huge part of our context in a communication we have that's going on. So that's one of the questions I do want to ask that of this group, of all of us, is, and I'll let if the other one respond to that as well, is Sean has this question here. This question is happening in a sort of echo chamber. How effective can we be if we don't address the messaging issue? And that's why I wanted to come back to this idea of perceptions versus reality. As an example, the 15-minute city has been recently deemed as yet another attack on freedom, and he puts in quotes, freedom. And for those that aren't familiar with 15-minute city, hopefully many of you are, the idea is if we build urban density to the point where you can be 15 minutes from anywhere or 15 minutes from any transit that gets you anywhere, then the idea is that you would have a complete city. The city would function better. You would have a more sustainable, resilient community. So I asked my panelists, what are your thoughts about that? How effective can we be if we don't address this kind of messaging issue, getting the ideas out there in a way that's important? So we're not in an echo chamber, but we're actually talking broadly across our communities. So Vatsal or Kimberly, whoever wants to take that question would be great.
You go first. You go first.
Like for echo chambers, that can happen anywhere, and that happens everywhere. So I agree with Sean's thought process. I think we need to go beyond that and build case studies, Eric. If we build case studies, build examples, that's where we can show the diversity of such programs, such activities, such initiatives, whatever we call it, whether we call it 15-minute city or there are so many different names have been floated over all these years. And so I think it's about talking about the diversity, including everybody in that discussion, and also trying to really figure out how do we message it, no doubt about it. So I think, again, going back to simple thought processes, let's create case studies so that, or examples so that, we don't box these things into a very defined definition, very honestly. And Kim, Eric, and I were talking about scalable tools. So those scalable tools are very useful because it's not about bounding the issue very tightly, but giving it a flexibility so that it can be applied in a community, in a city, in the United States, in the developed Western world, or other parts of the world. And I think that is where the flexibility of tools, flexibility of ideas, flexibility of initiatives can take place. And later, Eric, I wanted to also answer that question about the LEED for communities kind of applicability and how do you do it, but not now.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that because I want to talk about this. Go ahead, Kimberly, please.
This is a real, it's a valid question, right? So I think about my clients and the organizations I work with, and they're so busy building and managing housing, and they themselves are committed to building great green and resilient housing, but they're so busy with that they don't spend a lot of time on the messaging. And even often residents don't even realize that they are moving into a green building. And even though there are, education requirements and things like that. And I think part of it is a lot of the things we do for sustainability and resilience are not visible, right? They're buried in the assembly. And so it's hard for people to see what makes the building different, right? But I think at the organizational level and at the building level, it would be better if we could tell great stories about what's happening there and the values that are driving the decisions that resulted in the building that got built. So I don't know if I have a great answer, but it's a valid problem that deserves more attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I will say that one of the things I do so I have a class I teach here at Clarkson, Sustainable Infrastructure and Building. It's the name of the course. And one of the things I require of them to do for the students is I assign them a building that's typically gotten some sort of either certification or some sort of verification that's been done that's towards sustainability and resilience. And I ask them to write a memo to identify the sustainable features or resilient features in that building. And they have to go. I give them the construction documents. I'll give them things they can. Normally, it's on campus or someplace they can get to that's fairly easy. That's in part of the community. And I ask them to go to the building, go to this thing, see what's going on. And it's a struggle for people that even though these students are educated, they're engineering students typically, or environmental policy, and folks that have some sustainability language in their bones, and they struggle to kind of go in and see what's sustainable, what's resilient in this thing on the noun side of things, right? What's there? And I think we needed that. For them, it's an eye-opening experience to understand what are these concepts and how do I identify them within what I've been doing, because they're going to spend their lives either building buildings or developing infrastructure or working on policies related to them. And so, hey, let's start identifying what these things are. And so it's an eye-opening experience for them. I always appreciate the struggle they have to figure that out. And I think we do need to figure that out. And I like your example of case studies, Vatsal, to bring it back to that, to have exemplars. I think the case studies we also need to have are the ones that didn't work as well. We don't like doing that, but we need to have the ones say, this is what we thought was, but it really wasn't. And what we would have done differently is this. The counterfactual isn't always bad to put in there to say, here's what it might look like, along with the exemplars of where it's really went well and where even those that went well could do better, right? And so I think that's an important part of it. So I do want to pause here and Vatsal, let you answer that last question about LFC, if you want to kind of talk about that really quick, how that applies and so on. And then I will come back to some hand raises and a question in the chat that are coming through as well.
Yeah, and so just quickly, I think because we have a lot to cover, Eric. As you rightly said, any of these programs lead for cities or communities can apply anywhere. And I think it's good to do a very quick check. Kimberly knows this, you know this, we have a scorecard, we have a pre-feasibility toolkit, so people can really look into it and figure out whether my community really can apply to some of these kind of rating systems or not. And again, as I was trying to answer the previous question, we are trying to keep such tools a little bit more flexible, a little bit more scalable, so that various aspects can be looked into it. And we can discuss this more offline. But I think applicability, we just want to really apply such tools at all scales everywhere across the world. However, as Eric was saying, there are limitations. So we would like to know more about such limitations, if at all you have done any of these applications, and tell us what are the limitations. And if at all you may know about some solutions in which we can remove those limitations, that will be great for us in making such tools more widely applicable. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I know there's two people have their hand raised. Before I call on you, and as I could actually make it so you could verbalize your answer, I'm glad to do that, but I'm going to do that. So I have Brian Skeel. So I'm just going to give you a warning here. I'm going to let you speak for your own question because I think you have your hand up. If you don't want to have your hand up, please drop it so I don't do that. But Brian, I'm gonna allow you to talk. So you have to unmute yourself if you want to go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll return back to some of the Q&A written questions. Brian?
There we go. Hi there. Can you hear me now?
We can, sir.
Oh, all right. Yeah, this whole challenge to get people, the whole community involved in this dialogue. So we're tapping into the wisdom and the strengths and the talents of the community is something that to me seems essential. because the solutions that we need are, they're not currently the normal. The normal is hasn't worked. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it's glaring how here we have one of the most fire prone communities in the like top 10 in the country, and nobody is talking about that reality. And so it's such a big question. How do we prepare for it? And it's so much bigger than what the planning department can do, or the general plan, or the land use planning. So it's and we have gentrification that's really horrible, so that there's shortages in every level of service. There's shortages because housing is so expensive, and these all tie in together and demand more profound solutions than we've been doing. Inclusionary zoning and other, other taking advantage of the different government subsidies, and it's just it falls so short of what our needs are. And so I guess I'm wanting, and what I've learned is there's this process called the ABCD mapping process, asset-based community development mapping process, that comes out of the ABCD Institute. And it really starts with getting the community as totally engaged. And we're just not used to doing that. So I'd like you to, I mean, that's my question. It really is.
How do you get the community engaged? Yeah.
How do we scale to the level of demand that it's going to take to respond?
Great question. So let's, I'm going to go ahead and ask you, I'm going to go ahead and put you back so you can't, you're muted. But thank you for the question, Brian. Well, let's tackle it. Kimberly or Vatsal, who would like to take that one first?
Sure, I'll start with that. You know, at the community building or housing scale, it's a challenge, right? Because especially with new construction, you don't know who's going to be living there. So it's hard to talk to the future residents directly because you don't know who they are. And the housing will be built 3 or 4 years from now on the glacial time scales it takes to get affordable housing built. But nevertheless, organizations work at trying to find comparable sets of people to talk about what they would like to see in the housing and what contributions to the community they would like this new housing development to be able to make. And then in Boston, we have a number of formal planning and community review processes as well, which can sometimes feel adversarial. But you know, organizations try to come into that and have effective dialogue with community. But it's a challenge, and people are always trying different tools. And I know the Enterprise Community Partners, in their current version of their Green Communities program, has set out a whole formal process for having those conversations and doing these looks at, you know, who's going to live here, where is it located, how can this project be part of bringing equitable sustainability to this community. But Vatsal, what do you do in cities and communities?
Can you please summarize that question again?
So the question is, how do we get, how do we get community involvement and engagement at a level that's matching the scale of the challenge? In the case of Santa Fe, and to your point, I'm working with Los Alamos National Lab, so I'm very aware of your fire danger issues out there. There's a lot going on, and how do they get the community engagement, get community involvement at the front end more than we normally do in planning processes to get them to be able to meet the scale of the challenges.
No doubt. Thanks, Eric. And thanks for Brian asking that question. City of Santa Fe and City of Albuquerque, New Mexico, both are certified to lead for cities and communities. That doesn't mean that they have addressed all the questions, Brian, that you were asking. I think we all know that in urban planning, community planning, and implementation process, mostly the community engagement is done topic by topic and specific area oriented. So I think while some of the areas that you've highlighted, the fire related risk and dangers and all, and then building in some of those areas are not, is a big concern. I'm on Long Island, and we have a similar concern about water and storms and so on and so forth, and building in those areas. So I think it is very much specific. I totally agree with you that for each and every of those tasks, we need to reach out to specific people and areas that are affected. And especially in resilience, there is so much that we can cover that we need to go down to those specific pinch points, I would say, and at least talk to those people who are getting affected with those pinch points for those specific resilience related questions. However, for a larger community engagement, we still need to do, because there are so much of interconnection and so much of direct impacts and indirect impacts. So if you see one of my work on impacts of climate change on energy systems, obviously direct impacts were very simple, but I worked on indirect impacts. And there are so many aspects of it, like financial impacts and many other aspects of it. We need to really study those in quite a lot of detail, because so many different parts of the community are getting affected. So I think, again, Brian, to your question, we need to deep dive into those specific pinch points and start addressing them one after the other with involving respective people and communities and stakeholders that are affected.
I think I have a question back to Erik and Vatsal about this process, because I've been involved in some of these community-based planning processes as well. And, it's a real equity concern that we're all paid to be there in that room, right? Often paid well, right? And we expect the community to come for free, or maybe we feed them a sandwich or a slice of pizza and entertain their kids for a little while, right? And then we're talking in the abstract and the long term, and a lot of everyday people, they're worried about making sure they sign their permission slips for the kids' field trip for tomorrow, and things like that. And so how do we create equitable and meaningful participation experiences where the community feels like there's a direct benefit that they're going to understand, and not just maybe some abstract thing that might happen a decade from now? And how do we meaningfully compensate them for their participation in these kind of processes? What have you come up with in your different?
So I was good. Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that I'm deeply involved with. So I've got two projects I'm involved with right now that hit right at that. So I've been working now, and Vatsal knows this, very closely with the New York Olympic region. For those that don't know, the Adirondack Mountain Park, which is a state park here in New York State, has in the center of it Lake Placid. That was the home of the Miracle on Ice in the 1980s. And Lake Placid is this weird thing, because most of the park, if you look at real estate prices and things like that, compared to things like the Metro New York area, pretty depressed pricing, right? You can do pretty well for yourself to get a home in a lot of parts of the park. It's not a big challenge. There's limited amount of places that are considered for development. So, it's just not a place that people are developing rapidly. The exception is around Lake Placid, where so many people have summer homes, second homes. It goes back almost to the great lodges of yore in the robber baron era in the Adirondack Park. But it is extremely expensive, to the point that public servants, policemen, teachers, anybody in the hospitality industry, that's, by the way, the ones that are making Lake Placid the miracle place that it is, can't live there. They can't even be close. They can't afford the taxes, never mind actually afford the place. And so the average, the vehicles mile traveled per capita day in that community is over 100 miles. 100 miles. So think about that. That is all driven by all the hospitality workers are living in further flung locations, or being bussed in. It is kind of crazy because of the nature of what's going on. And so, but you know what? When we go to a public meeting, they're not the residents of that community. right? So how do you get their voices as part of it? They're directly impacted by the economy going on there. So how do we, so for that community, what we've been doing a lot of is trying to meet them there. Ride the bus back and forth to their home, right? They're coming from Plattsburgh, which is, by the way, about an hour away from Lake Placid, and go there, get on a bus with them in the morning and talk to them. Another project I'm doing is in a more rural location, even Lake Placid, which is up in our region here in northern New York, is have a whole Amish population. And you think an online survey is going to get to an Amish person? You got a whole other thing going to you, right? So how do you do that? Well, again, you got to meet them where they are. You know, I'm not a Mennonite, but I could go to a Mennonite service, and actually our students are going along what's called ride-alongs because they will use public transportation. So we can meet them on that public transportation and talk to them. But we got to engage, we got to meet, what that changes the idea of you're going to magically pull things out from data sources, whether it be online or elsewhere, to really get the temperature of where you want to go and what you want to do is not going to work. You're going to have to go out and reach out to them. And this is in lots of different communities. You can look at disadvantaged communities in urban areas. Again, Schenectady is another example for that, where you got to kind of go where they are. That is not easy. It's expensive. It's not easy. You've got to do it in a place and time that works for them. None of that's easy. And this is why, you know, things like voting is, you know, part of what we should be looking at is why are people voting? Well, they don't have time to go vote. Well, if they don't have time to go vote, are they going to speak to you about whether or not that you want to do community planning? So you got to think about how do you meet them where they are and try to figure that out. And that's not been the normal way. But, you know, with legions of things called students, which, by the way, are magical things, that want to learn this stuff, we're able to starting to bridge that. Now, I will not say we're perfect. We're not even close, and it's complicated. I mean, I have people that live in the community in Lake Placid that still have floors that are made of dirt. There's no flooring, right? And that's the level of disparity between the, you know, multi-million-dollar homes and a hovel that essentially has a dirt floor. That's the disparity. And so how do you gotta go start, and it's not easy, but you got to start going where they are. So Vatsal, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I requested Maria to post one link about Detroit. And I was an observer to Detroit's sustainability action agenda. And they've worked on it almost 2.5 years ago. But the kind of detailed process that they did to reach out to almost all parts of the community was quite impressive. They had local community members creating teams and working with those individual communities all across the city and so on and so forth. And they deployed various types of platforms and ways in which they could reach out to people, not only digital platforms, but you know, one-to-one kind of ways in which their teams reached out to local communities. So I think I just put a link there. It's a humongous exercise. They did it over 1.5 years, and it's just amazing. It's a 43 action agenda items and so on and so forth. They have tried to do a lot of good stuff. So just an example. Please have a look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Hiram in the chat mentioned a Sustainable Connecticut effort where they paid people to come, and that's I recently did a grant request to do just that, to actually have paid stipends for people to participate and things like that. So thank you for that, Hiram. That's great. I'm going to ask one more question out of the questions that have been coming in, and I think this is an interesting question. It was really posed for Kimberly, but I think it's really good for all of us to talk about. Is talking about sustainability and resiliency enough, or should we be talking about restorative practices, restorative processes? So question, should we just be talking about resilience and sustainability, or we need to talk about restorative? Because I think it keys right on this discussion. And so Kimberly, it was originally posed to you, but I think we can all maybe chime in on this.
So is that thinking in terms of the living building challenge type restorative?
The question was from a little while back, so I don't know. It was as you were introducing the idea of talking about it, so I don't know. But I think we go a lot of directions with it.
Yeah, I think, you know, certainly there are people who are pulling us in that direction, right? To think that through. I think living in an urban context, it's a little hard to figure out what that means, though I know there are good thinkers who are working hard on that. You know, I think in affordable housing, it's hard and expensive to get it built, and so I worry sometimes when the next greatest thing gets pushed onto affordable housing, especially. And I do, like, in the places around Boston where we're building affordable housing, it's not so much about ecological restoration and that sort of thinking about restorative, but it's more about how are we rebuilding community and neighborhood fabric, and are we creating places for local businesses to be able to rent space, and do we create gathering spaces for the people who live in the building, but that can also be available for other community organizations? Are we bringing back, lively, walkable streets? And are we making it safe places for people to hang out? And so I think, to the extent that restorative is about the economies and the social connectivity, I think that is an important value for developers and their teams to try to bring into the conversation and to realize in the projects.
Yeah, I think, that to add on is, I live in an area, right, and I work in areas that have a variety of different things. So you think of restorative, thinking about disadvantaged communities, we live with a lot of indigenous in our area, right? So the Akwesasne, Mohawk live in our area. And how do you think about where they've been in the situations where they've been deliberately, either through racism or other things, been put behind the curve? So how do you think about those communities, and then think about our responsibility as we come in and try to help? Becoming the hero and having a hero complex actually becomes counterproductive. And how do we think about, instead, again, kind of coming to them with an open hand and open mind and listening to them and figuring out how to go forward is a key part of any kind of restorative process. And it's going to be imperfect. The recognition that from my faith background, I have an understanding that, we all fall short. We're all sinners at some level, if you will. But we're also saints. We're also empowered to make things better. But that first comes from acknowledging where we are and acknowledging how we can do better together. And I think that might be a key part of any kind of restorative practice. Vatsal, anything you want to add to that?
So yeah, restorative, and I think there is another question that is being asked in this particular discussion around 103, is that cities are developing, growing, and poor are pushed out to the fringes as prices increase very hard. So I just wanted to leverage that question and the restorative discussion and what Kim was addressing about affordable housing thing, and I just wanted to highlight one interesting part of the resilience, which is the resilience of people. Resilience in terms of not all these factors that I was trying to technically highlight, but also the resilience to really be there and do something good over years. And especially the question that was asked by an anonymous questioner is that, I think that is very useful. We all need to start thinking about it, and redlining practices that have taken place in all these, in our US cities for last 50, 70 years. And at the same time, eradicating communities to build those big highways. And now many of those roads are being restoratively put back to have communities back there, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are different terminologies. I don't want to highlight those, but I think point here is that what do we do with really bringing the livelihood back, the same restore the glory of those 50, 70 years back is very important. And I think we can't do it in one stroke, but I think point is that, can we start somewhere? Can we begin somewhere? And the current, probably for last 10, 15 years, a lot of efforts have been put in to really work with such communities across our cities, and to offer skill, but as Kim and many others are doing, to really provide affordable housing that is green, livable, sustainable. But at the same time, what do we need to do to bring skills back, finance back, so that the real value of these communities are recognized? We all love our inner cities, and there is so much of wealth, heritage, and so much there. So how can we really constructively work with such communities to value their resilience over all these years, but at the same time give back what has been lost in last 50, 70 years? Again, we'll have to evaluate, as Erik was initially trying to talk about, those 3 pillars of our discussion. But I think still we need to do something very substantially there. And I think that is a part of restorative, part of resilience, and part of recognizing the damage, and how can we repair it over time is a kind of big challenge.
Yeah. I will say that I was privileged to be at the New York State Green Building Conference last week, where there was a great panel discussing highway removal across New York State, and in a specific part of it was hitting on this discussion. But the caveats in all of that have been thinking about not just the physical infrastructure part, but how do you re-knit people together, and working through that. And it's going to require, again, different things. I think an earlier question that Brian was asking, how do you bring people to scale? You got to bring people together where they are, and figure out ways you can work with them, and excite them about where they can go. That we have the future in front of us can be better. We can be a part of that. So I'm going to ask. So I've Len Pavelka, excuse me, Len Pavelka, who's had his hand up for a long time. I'm going to ask him. I'm going to allow him to talk and unmute him, or ask him to unmute himself. So go ahead and ask his question. Len, are you with us still? Len? You've unmuted yourself, so I'll give you one more moment. All right. Well, I don't think Len is with us anymore. So we'll go to another question then. Sorry about that. We'll go ahead and move on to another question, which comes out of our chat, and I think it's an interesting question that we should really think about. Sustainable planning. How do you look at the risk in a development further downstream of a new development through ensuring no impact on existing, or I would say improvement of the existing, perhaps? So how do we think about those downstreams, those secondary, tertiary, beyond effects, and thinking about the downstream as we think about community development, whether it be housing development or otherwise? Whoever wants to take it from maybe Kimberly, I don't know who wants to take that first.
Well, I don't know if I have a solution, but I'll give you an example of the challenge, right? So, right, in Boston is trying to look at neighborhood and, large scale solutions to climate, especially C, but in the meantime, they're demanding that individual building owners do things. So East Boston is getting a lot of the gentrification pressure that got raised earlier. And so these big new condo buildings are going in along the shore, and they are doing all of these resilience measures for their building, but they have the effect of channeling water because, around their complexes and into the vulnerable streets and the affordable housing that's located across the street. And there isn't built into the codes and the zoning overlays yet those considerations that, you have to address the challenges on your site, but by doing so, you can't cause problems for the people around you. And I think that gets at to this question of where is the burden on the individual building and where is the shared burden to address these problems, right? And so if the city and all of us are contributing to solving the problem at the neighborhood scale, then this becomes less of an issue with an individual building, solving its own problems, but causing problems for others. So I think it gets at that, where do we take action, and where is the equity or the inequity about, where those requirements are.
Okay, Vatsal, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we very much encourage, as a part of Lead for Cities and Communities rating system, to start looking into the impacts of this community that you are building. And we are talking about communities going net zero energy, net zero water, net zero waste, zero carbon. and so on and so forth. But also we are trying to request them to talk about not only the cube or the square that you are creating, but what are its impacts on the adjoining areas is also very important, because ultimately, all these communities that are getting created around a larger urban fabric or peri-urban or rural fabric. And I think that is where, this is not an alien ship coming into something, but how it can interconnect and integrate into the larger fabric around them is a larger question that we ask them. And many questions, many credits, many requirements are like that. What are you doing with the community around you? Thank you.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, kind of one final thought is that, for those that aren't aware, there's a new standard that the ISO put out, American Standards, National Standards Institute, ANSI ISO put out on this idea of a total cost of ownership. It's an interesting concept, where we look at no longer as like a first cost or even life cycle costs. We think about long term. What about disassembly cost? What about the different aspects of renewal? What about environmental impacts? Really long things. What about it actually bringing in ways we can? Now that's very much an economic tool to look at that, or an economic manner to look at that. There's a corollary, of course. What's the total benefit of ownership or benefit of having these things, right? We should look at those as well. But that kind of broader thinking, and there's an actual ANSI standard again for this, APA 1000-1 and 1000-2, and that's certainly a tool that you could use to kind of start getting at some of these things. But again, it's only going to look at one hue. It's kind of the economic, what's the costs or what are the economic benefits? But you can start wrapping your head around the broader thinking behind those and say, hey, how do we just start thinking about what are all the things beyond just what we think is a life cycle? What about the things that come in from the externalities? And one of the things that we've talked about with the idea of sustainable holistic planning systems is we actually think about the outside. What is actually, we plan for the outside, plan for the disruption, plan for where things are not going to be what we think they will be. The unknown unknowns, if you will, unks that are out there. How do we accept that they're going to happen and address it? Who would have thought we'd have a global pandemic, right? And that would change our lives. But it happens, right? So how do you kind of start thinking about what ifs? And it's okay to look at what if as much as what is. I think those are important to think about. So I wish this has been an awesome conversation. Believe it or not, we've already got to 20 after 1 in this conversation. It's been awesome. Thank you, Kimberly and Vatsal, for that. I want to give each a 2 minute, 1 minute, 2 minute final comment on the session today, what your thoughts are, and then we have some closing matters. But thank you again for this. So Vatsal, will you go first? Since I gave Kimberly the first question out the door, I'll let you go first in this one.
Kimberly, I was requesting you to go first. Sorry.
Oh, you were passing the baton, huh? Well, I just want to say I'm so glad that we in the USGBC community are having this conversation, and that we are saying, because we have been focused on buildings, right? The U.S. Green Building Council, right? And this is really stretching us and stretching the concepts and stretching the mission of USGBC to really systematically incorporate resilience and to explicitly, although it's been implicit, explicitly bring climate, carbon, and resilience into what we're trying to achieve through our buildings. So I'm really, again, glad to have been part of the conversation here today.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I think, again, I wanted to thank Erik, our colleagues in the main region, Kimberly, you, and for all the participants for this active participation, actively asking all these interesting questions. And many of you have highlighted some interesting suggestions or best practices that are taking place in your respective regions and elsewhere. So this is a very valuable, and I think as Erik and my colleagues, Madia and others have highlighted, that we are recording this, we are going to put it up online as well. I think one simple process that I see valuable is that, as Kimberly was saying, We at USGBC have been for last 30 years focusing on mostly buildings. Now we are starting to think about communities and cities, the entire ecosystem around it, the urban habitat ecosystem around it. And I think our interest is that when we are talking about one building, definitely that is not, again, an exclusive discussion, but it is an integral part of a larger urban fabric, as I was telling earlier, or rural fabric or peri-urban fabric. And I think that is where we need to start talking about communities as a whole, communities that we impact and affect. And I think that is where this thought process came up, that when we are talking about one building, can we start talking about a community, a city, or a region around it, and how are we affecting it? And it is not, or it should not be only about few, meaning few selective people or buildings or developers who can work with US Green Building Council and the concepts of going green, equitable, sustainable, public health wise, it is all encompassing and all, but it is about communities and how do we really talk about everybody around us, we including, because we are part of those larger urban fabrics as well every day. So I think it's about what you said, I think, Kimberly, earlier, where we all work, live, play, and do our activities equitably. Sustainability is a larger thought process, and we respect you all to be a part of this discussion and moving forward. For especially lead for communities discussion, we would want to invite you all to provide your inputs, and we will be opening up some opportunities to provide these inputs, not only in improving the rating system, but also in trying to take us out in the market as well. So thank you again. It's my pleasure.
Well, thank you, Vatsal and Kimberly. I'll just add one final thing to think about. Since this is co-sponsored by the Society of Military Engineers, I think the military has really come onto the fore, understanding that this is, we think about for buildings and going to communities, but this is our whole nation is needing to think about this, right? This is a national defense priority to have resilience in our communities so that we can weather the different storms we have. And it's become global. I've been watching the chat as we go along. There's somebody from New Zealand on this call today. And so people are being impacted. I mean, I gotta say, that's the farthest from where we're talking physically, because we're all in the Northeast of the United States. Thank you for joining us. But places are needing this, and we need to figure out this as a global challenge, and we got to bring to the fore all we can. And I would be remiss in not talking about things like codes, building codes and things like that. But beyond that, zoning codes and land use codes, we talked about the challenges we've had with those, but codes play a big part. My colleague at Ryan Kolkler at the International Code Council, we constantly talk about how that's going to evolve and change. And so we can't stand pat. We've got to continue to move. And I think that's an exciting part of this work. And thank you for the conversation today. It's been really, really great to have that. So let me, again, share my screen one last time to kind of do some closeout things. Again, thank you for the conversation, Vatsal and Kimberly. Really great. I know there's more questions. We left 9 questions in the Q&A. There were other ones in the chat that came through. We'll try to collect that and see if we can get some answers back to you all. We'll send them out to the panelists, myself, and see if we can get back to you. Someone I would love to answer. We just did not have the time. So just a reminder, these were the questions that you're going to see later. And I think you can figure out that we've kind of really hit on all these questions in different ways. Where codes and standards and how they think about overall resilience. We've talked about that they're having an impact. We got to go beyond that. What are these systems? There's some slides you can go back to. We can talk about. We've talked about Lead for Communities, and of course, Kimberly, I think you've really highlighted the housing challenges. So be looking if you're looking for the engineer PDH credits, you're going to get a little survey on these. It'll be open forum type questions, but these are the questions we're going to be asking you to get. The other ones, I believe we don't need to have that. You've attended as long as we've got your attendance. So if you're concerned, Medea should be getting that to you about making sure your name's known so we can get your tracking on who is attending. And there's a lot of us. There was almost 100 folks with us today. So thank you all for attending. So we're glad, just as our folks that were on today. Remember, it's GBCI credits as well. That's an important, you get that, and you get 1.5 CE hours out of this. So for those needing your lead AP to move forward, want to remind you of some upcoming events. This is not a one and done. There's a lot more coming. First off, there's a free USGBC education course there in March that's available. Prioritizing Nature for Equity and Resilience. It sounds like something that'll be interesting to this crowd. You can take it as a webinar format. You can take it, I think, at your own pace. So Medea, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but you can absolutely do that. And it's, it's created for green build. So you can take advantage of that. This series continues next month. We're going to be talking about New York City's coastal resiliency initiatives, what they are. So look forward to that in April 19th, around about the same back channel as you're seeing here on Zoom. I'm looking forward to that. And as I mentioned, we'll have a series, another one in May, and then looking at one in June. We'll get more advertising about that. Be on the lookout for that. And then the series ends in October timeframe. We're finalizing it for the summit on resilience, and we'll be coming back to some of these topics to kind of round them out even further. And then don't forget that USGBC is offering a decarbonization summit. Kimberly, you brought up decarbonization several times in the things you're talking about with housing. And that's happening April 5th through 6th online, and you can take advantage of that. So look out for that through the USGBC online forums and things of that nature. And with all that, I just want to thank everybody again, Vatsal, Kimberly, and the whole team supporting us here in the background. Really appreciate what you've been doing. Medea, any final things to clean up for administratively logistics to close out for today?
I think you covered everything. Thank you to our speakers. Thanks to all the attendees. And if you are looking for PDH credits, look for my survey in the email. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all and have a great afternoon or morning if you're in New Zealand. So have a great one.
See if our people drop off.
Yeah, I think they will. They're getting there. We're down to 36. So thank you again. Really appreciate it, Kimberly. I love doing this. This is a great conversation. Thanks for
Oh,
doing
it's
it.
fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Really glad I could be part of it. I really appreciate being invited. Thank you.
No problem. And we'll get on the YouTube thing and all that kind of good thing. Medea, are you gonna be able to capture all the questions and kind of just send them out by email? Is that something you can do?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that before I close it down. Oh, I should
In the
stop
chat. So
recording.
there's a bunch of, there was like 3 or 4 questions in the chat.